Okay, in this video we're going to talk about how to change out a complete spring brake chamber. So a few things about that before we get started. Remember, if we are changing out this whole spring brake chamber, it would be because either air is leaking out the holes on the spring brake side of it for the parking brake, meaning the diaphragm has a hole in it, or air is leaking out the service brake side, which is always closest to the mounting studs, meaning that diaphragm has a leak in it. So there's two diaphragms inside here. If you can see, we have two air ports. The one closest to the push rod or the mounting bolts will say service brake, meaning it's for this side. The one closest to the back will say spring brake, meaning it's the one to release the spring so the truck can roll. Remember that big spring we talked about in the previous video will hold this truck in place. Well, two of them will, with 80,000 pounds, like on a hill. It will also slow the truck down and stop it in the event we lose air pressure. So that's the reason we have that big spring back here, is to actually apply the brakes mechanically when we don't have air pressure to keep it released. So in the previous video, we talked about changing out this diaphragm. That would be why we would be changing this, because we don't open this backside back here if it's leaking. We could, as long as we cage it, follow all the steps we've covered before, we could take this front section apart, take the band off, change out the diaphragm like we did in the previous video for the service brakes. This front section is much the same, and if it's leaking, I don't know if you can see here, but this has cracks all around the edge there where it's been flexed. Eventually that cracks all the way through, so you start having air leaking through the diaphragm, so that would be why we would be replacing it. Most spring brake chambers now, this whole back section here is sealed. You can't take the band off to try to replace the diaphragm. No one in their right mind would want to expose that spring. So generally, if it's leaking in this back section, out these holes, we would put a spring brake chamber on it. So that's what we're going to cover in this video. So these things are universal. They can be on multiple trucks. So what that means is, if you see from here, now this is not caged, but this has a very, very long threaded shaft coming out of it. That's because it can be cut to different lengths for different trucks. If you can see on this one here installed, there's your mounting bolts on the front. It's really only about that far to this clevis that's hooked to the slack adjuster here. So that is critical, which we'll get to in another video, but this has to come out where it is 90 degrees from here to there in this rod. So DOT, federal guidelines want that to be a 90-degree angle. So the way that becomes a 90-degree angle is where exactly this shaft coming out of this brake chamber is cut off at. So if you put the whole chamber on there, different slack adjusters have different templates and procedures, but you're going to be putting a template on here. I'm not going to go over that right now because it's specific to different applications, but you're going to be putting this on there to line some things up. There's going to be a measurement that you do to determine the right length for this, to make sure that that is at 90 degrees. So kind of the rule of thumb I have, which is, this is not going to be in the book, but if I check this with the brakes applied before I disassemble anything and I am at 90 degrees here, I really don't need a template, because I'm going to cage this chamber obviously before I take it off. The new chamber I'm installing is going to be caged all the way, meaning that this rod is pulled in and the spring back here is compressed. So theoretically, as long as that was at 90 degrees before, if I measure this old one being caged, measure the new one for the same length being caged, and cut it off, then I should be right back at my 90 degrees. So that's kind of the way a lot of mechanics kind of do this. Now, if it's not at 90 degrees, that means that someone cut this off to the wrong length before, then you need the template and everything to get it back truly at 90 degrees, because that is very important for brake balance purposes. So we're at 90 here. We would cage that, remove this chamber, only after it's caged, because we don't do anything with this chamber unless that caging bolt is installed, because right now with no air pressure on it, there is roughly 2,000 pounds of force on this little pin on these mounting bolts, because the brakes are applied. Even though this is a little trainer, it would be just like on the truck. I can't take these off. I can't get that out, anything, until this is caged. Okay. So this whole chamber, I would have to cage it, cut it off like I said. If you put the lock nut on here and run it all the way down before you cut this off, a hacksaw is going to damage your starting threads. You can take the nut that is on there and run it back off of there, and it will straighten that thread out where that you don't have issues getting the clevis to thread back on here, because it is threaded. This is just a lock nut back here to lock it all down to keep it in place. So there's threads inside here. The bolt, if you cut it too long, sticks out through the clevis and runs into the slack adjuster itself. So that's why it's critical that it's cut off to the right length. You want enough threads in here to hold and not pull out, but not stick out the end when you have your 90-degree angle. We've got some pipe fittings here for the air lines. So those being pipe thread, we would have to put Teflon tape or some kind of thread sealer when we put these fittings in. The majority of the time on a truck, this is actually the hose end that installs into here without a fitting, and it goes up to a valve on the back of the truck that has a swivel fitting on it. So either way, it's still pipe thread, so it has to have some kind of pipe sealer on there because of it being pipe thread and the way pipe thread works. So there's a little more to replacing this whole chamber. In the next video, we'll talk about how to install a piggyback, which is a whole lot easier.